"Get out of my neighborhood." Our HOA president screamed this at my wife just for unloading moving boxes. That's right, Patricia called the police on us because we had the audacity to move into a house we legally owned. She told officers we were suspicious military types, threatening community safety, demanding they arrest us immediately. This deranged woman was so convinced she'd caught dangerous criminals that she practically bounced with excitement, waiting for our dark secrets to be exposed. But when my wife calmly handed over her driver's license, then that second ID, Patricia's smug expression literally froze. She had no idea what was coming next. Comment below where you're watching from. BD Stories family. But let me back up and tell you how we got here. It all started on what should have been the happiest day of our lives, moving into our dream home in Maplewood Estates. Rebecca and I had been house hunting for months, and when we found this beautiful two-story colonial with the white picket fence and manicured lawn, we knew it was perfect. The neighborhood looked like something out of a magazine. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained sidewalks, and houses that screamed American dream. What we didn't know was that our new neighbor, Patricia Williams, was about to turn our paradise into a living nightmare. I'm Alex, by the way, and I'm a graphic designer who works from home. Rebecca's well, let's just say she has a very interesting background that Patricia was about to discover the hard way. The moving truck had barely pulled into our driveway when Patricia materialized like a bad omen. She was exactly what you'd picture when someone says HOA Karen. Perfectly styled blonde hair, tennis outfit, and that special combination of fake smile and dead eyes that screams, "I live to make people miserable." She marched right up to our front porch like she owned the place, clipboard in hand, ready for battle. "Excuse me," she said in that sickly sweet voice that immediately made my skin crawl. "But I don't believe we've been properly introduced. I'm Patricia Williams, president of the Maplewood Estates Homeowners Association." The way she said president made it sound like she was announcing herself as the Queen of England. Rebecca looked up from directing the movers and gave Patricia a polite nod. "Nice to meet you. I'm Rebecca, and this is my husband Alex." But Patricia wasn't interested in pleasantries. "This is a family neighborhood," Patricia continued, her eyes scanning our moving boxes like she was conducting a security inspection. "What's your story? Where are you from? What kind of work do you do?" The questions came rapid fire, and I could feel my blood pressure rising. Who the hell did this woman think she was conducting an interrogation on our own property? Rebecca remained perfectly calm, which should have been Patricia's first warning sign. "We're from Denver," Rebecca replied evenly. "Alex is a graphic designer, and I recently left my previous job." Patricia's eyes narrowed like a predator sensing weakness. "Previous job? What kind of work?" There was something in her tone that rubbed me the wrong way, like she was already building a case against us. Rebecca just smiled and said, "Government work," then turned back to the movers. But Patricia wasn't done, not by a long shot. "Well," Patricia said, pulling out her clipboard with theatrical authority, "I'll need to see your proper documentation and HOA approval forms. We have very strict standards here in Maplewood Estates." I felt my jaw drop. Documentation for moving into a house we owned. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "We bought this house fair and square. We don't need anyone's approval." Patricia's fake smile grew wider and more sinister. "Oh, but you do. Every new resident must be approved by the HOA board. We need background checks, employment verification, and character references from your previous neighborhood." She said it like she was announcing the law of the land. Rebecca set down the box she was carrying and looked Patricia straight in the eye. "Is that so?" she asked quietly. Something in Rebecca's tone made me glance at her sharply, but her expression remained perfectly neutral. The next few hours were like watching a masterclass in passive-aggressive warfare. Patricia stationed herself across the street with a lawn chair and a pair of binoculars, monitoring the situation, as she put it. Every 20 minutes, she'd march over with a new violation. The moving truck was parked improperly. We were making too much noise. Our temporary parking permit was displayed incorrectly. She had an answer for everything, and she delivered each criticism with that same toxic smile. I was ready to lose my mind, but Rebecca just nodded politely and said, "We'll take care of it." By evening, Patricia had written up 7 different violations and informed us that we'd be receiving formal notices in the mail. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said with a smirk that made me want to throw something. "I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot of each other." After Patricia finally retreated to her house, I exploded. What the hell was that? Who does she think she is? We need to report her to someone. Rebecca was unpacking our security system with methodical precision, which struck me as odd since that hadn't been a priority in our old house. "Relax, Alex," she said calmly. "Let her make the first real mistake." There was something in her voice, a coldness that I'd never heard before. "First mistake? She's been making mistakes all day." But Rebecca just shook her head and continued setting up cameras around our property. "No," she said quietly. "She's been establishing a pattern, and patterns are very useful things." I had no idea what she meant, but I was about to find out that my wife was playing a game that Patricia didn't even know existed. That night, I was restless. The confrontation with Patricia had left me wired, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Around midnight, I got up to get some water and happened to glance at the security monitor Rebecca had set up in our kitchen. What I saw made my blood run cold. Patricia was in our front yard, crouched by our door, trying the handle and taking photos through our windows with her phone. She moved like someone who'd done this before, systematic, methodical checking every angle. I was about to charge outside when Rebecca's hand landed on my shoulder. "Don't," she said quietly. "Let me handle this." I turned to look at my wife, and for the first time in 5 years of marriage, I saw something in her eyes that I'd never seen before. Something cold and calculating and absolutely terrifying. "Alex," she said in that same deadly calm voice. "She's not just crazy, she's methodical and systematic. I've dealt with her type before." The next morning, I watched Rebecca review the security footage with the kind of focus I'd seen her use for work projects. But this was different. She was studying Patricia's movements like she was analyzing enemy intelligence. When I asked her about it, she just pointed to a certificate on one of our unpacked boxes, a military commendation I'd seen before, but never really paid attention to. "From your army days?" I asked. Rebecca nodded, but didn't elaborate. "Patricia has no idea what she's dealing with," she said simply, "and that's going to be her biggest mistake." Yet I wanted to ask more questions, but something in Rebecca's expression told me that this conversation was over. All I knew was that Patricia Williams had picked the wrong neighbors to mess with. But what Rebecca doesn't tell Alex is what she's really planning to do about Patricia. And trust me, her military background is about to become Patricia's worst nightmare. What do you think Rebecca's next move should be? Drop your predictions below. BD Stories has more drama coming. If I thought day one was bad, Patricia Williams was just getting warmed up. The formal violations started arriving in our mailbox within 48 hours. Professionally printed notices on official HOA letterhead that detailed our numerous infractions. The grass is too long by half an inch. The mailbox was painted the wrong shade of black. Unauthorized vehicle parking because Rebecca's car wasn't perfectly centered in our driveway. Each violation came with a $25 fine and a 14-day compliance deadline. By the end of the week, we'd accumulated over $300 in penalties for things so trivial they bordered on insane. "This is harassment," I told Rebecca as I read through the latest batch. "We need to fight this." But Rebecca just filed each notice in a folder labeled evidence and continued her methodical documentation of everything Patricia did. I was starting to realize my wife had a plan, but she wasn't sharing it with me yet. The real escalation came the following Monday when Patricia decided to make our conflict public. I was working in my home office when I heard raised voices outside. Through my window, I could see Patricia at our mailbox waving papers at Rebecca like she was conducting a public execution. "I run this neighborhood," Patricia was shouting loud enough for half the street to hear. "You'll follow my rules or pack up and leave. This is a respectable community, and we don't tolerate troublemakers." Rebecca stood perfectly still, arms crossed, letting Patricia rant. Other neighbors had started coming out of their houses to watch the show, and I could see Patricia playing to her audience. "Some people think they can just move in here and ignore our standards." She continued, her voice carrying that special brand of righteous indignation that only comes from someone who's never been truly challenged. "Well, I have news for them. This is my neighborhood." I couldn't take it anymore. I stormed outside, ready to give Patricia a piece of my mind, but Rebecca caught my arm before I could say anything. "Let her dig her own grave deeper," she said quietly, but firmly enough that I stopped in my tracks. Patricia noticed our interaction and turned her attention to me with predatory enthusiasm. "Oh, and here's the husband," she announced to our growing audience of neighbors. "Maybe you can talk some sense into your wife. She seems to think the rules don't apply to her." The way she said "your wife" made it sound like an insult. I opened my mouth to respond, but Rebecca's grip on my arm tightened slightly, a warning I'd learned to recognize over the years. So I stood there and watched my wife let Patricia hang herself with her own rope, though I didn't understand the strategy at the time. What happened next was like watching a master manipulator at work. Patricia began canvassing our neighbors, going door to door with her clipboard and her toxic charm. I watched from our window as she spent 30 minutes at each house, no doubt spinning tales about the dangerous new residents who were threatening the neighborhood's peace and property values. She was particularly focused on the elderly residents and the families with young children, anyone who might be naturally inclined to worry about security. Within days, I noticed the change. Neighbors who had waved politely before now avoided eye contact. Mrs. Henderson from next door, who had brought us cookies on moving day, suddenly found reasons to hurry inside whenever she saw us. The couple across the street installed new security cameras that seemed suspiciously pointed toward our house. Patricia's masterpiece was the creation of an official neighborhood watch group, which she announced via an email blast to all residents. Due to recent security concerns, the message read, "The Maplewood Estates HOA is establishing enhanced monitoring protocols. Residents are encouraged to report any suspicious activities, unusual visitors, or violations of community standards." She held the inaugural meeting in her living room, and I counted 15 neighbors in attendance through her front window. Patricia had positioned herself as the protector of Maplewood Estates, and we were the threat she was protecting everyone from. It was brilliant in a completely psychotic way. She wasn't just harassing us anymore, she was turning the entire neighborhood against us while making herself look like a hero. The surveillance escalated to stalking within a week. Patricia would follow us to the grocery store, photographing our license plates and documenting our activities. She'd sit in her car outside our house for hours, taking notes about who visited us and when we left. When Rebecca went for her morning runs, Patricia would trail behind in her SUV at a respectful distance, like some kind of suburban private investigator. The woman had clearly lost any semblance of normal behavior, but she was doing it all under the guise of community safety. I started losing sleep, jumping at every sound, wondering what fresh hell Patricia would dream up next. But Rebecca remained completely calm, continuing her own documentation with the methodical precision of someone building a legal case. "We have to do something," I told Rebecca one evening as we watched Patricia set up what looked like a camping chair across the street for another night of monitoring. "This is getting out of hand." Rebecca was reviewing her own files, photos, videos, timestamps, violations. She'd been keeping track of everything with military precision, though I still didn't understand why. "She's establishing a pattern," Rebecca said matter-of-factly. "Harassment, stalking, intimidation, abuse of authority. Every day she digs herself deeper." There was something in her voice that made me look at her more carefully. My wife wasn't stressed or angry like I was. She was satisfied, like things were going exactly according to some plan I wasn't privy to. "What aren't you telling me?" I asked. Rebecca looked up from her files and smiled. Not the warm smile I knew and loved, but something colder and more calculating. "Patience, Alex. She's about to make the mistake I've been waiting for." As if summoned by Rebecca's words, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. Before I could answer, I heard Patricia's voice through our open window. She was on her front porch talking loudly enough to be heard by anyone who cared to listen. "Yes, I need to report a situation," she was saying into her phone with theatrical urgency. "I'm being threatened by new neighbors. They have military training and weapons, and I'm genuinely scared for my life and the safety of our community." She continued with an Oscar-worthy performance, describing us as dangerous individuals who were intimidating residents and violating multiple community standards. "Please send officers immediately," she concluded. "This situation is escalating rapidly, and I fear for everyone's safety." Then she hung up and looked directly at our house with a smile of pure malicious satisfaction. That's when something incredible happened. Instead of panicking like I was, Rebecca calmly stood up and walked to our front closet. She retrieved her purse, a simple black leather bag I'd seen 1,000 times, and checked its contents with the same methodical care she'd been showing all week. "Perfect," she said quietly, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she looked genuinely pleased. "It's time." I stared at my wife, completely baffled by her reaction. We had police sirens getting closer by the minute, a crazy neighbor who'd just painted us as dangerous criminals, and half the neighborhood convinced we were threats to their safety. But Rebecca looked like she'd just won the lottery. "Time for what?" I asked. She turned to me with that cold smile again and said, "Time to show Patricia Williams exactly who she's been messing with." What's in Rebecca's purse that makes her so confident? And why is she actually happy that Patricia called the cops? You're about to find out why you should never mess with someone when you don't know their background. Comment on Rebecca's secret BD stories drops new drama weekly. The sound of police sirens filled our quiet suburban street like something out of a crime drama, except this was real life, and my psychotic neighbor had just called the cops on us. 2 patrol cars pulled up with their lights flashing, creating an instant spectacle that drew every remaining neighbor out of their houses. Patricia emerged from her front door like she was taking the stage at Carnegie Hall, already in full victim mode, with tears streaming down her face and her hand pressed dramatically to her chest. "Thank God you're here," she wailed to the officers loud enough for the entire block to hear. "I've been so scared. They've been stalking me, taking pictures of my house, and threatening me and my family." She pointed at us with a shaking finger, the picture of a terrified suburban mother defending her home. It was a performance worthy of an Academy Award, and I could see our neighbors buying every word of it. Officer Johnson, a tall, serious-looking man in his 40s, approached our front porch with his partner, while Patricia continued her theatrical breakdown behind them. "Evening, folks," he said in that professional cop voice that immediately made me nervous, even though we'd done nothing wrong. "We received a call about some kind of disturbance. Mind if we have a word?" I opened my mouth to explain that our neighbor was completely insane, but Rebecca stepped forward with the kind of calm confidence that made me realize she'd been expecting this moment. "Of course, officer," she said politely, though I should mention that everything Mrs. Williams described has been the other way around. "We have extensive documentation if you'd like to see it." The way she said extensive documentation should have been Patricia's first clue that she'd made a serious miscalculation. "She's lying," Patricia shrieked from across the yard, abandoning any pretense of composure. "She's been stalking me for days, taking pictures through my windows. She has military weapons in that house, and I'm terrified she's going to hurt someone." She was really laying it on thick now, probably sensing that the officers weren't immediately dragging us away in handcuffs. They have no respect for our community standards. They're dangerous people who don't belong in a family neighborhood like this. Officer Johnson's partner was taking notes, and I could see more neighbors gathering on their front porches to watch the show. Patricia had turned our quiet street into a 3-ring circus, and she was the star performer. But she was about to discover that Rebecca had been preparing for this exact moment. "Ma'am," Officer Johnson said, addressing both of us, but looking primarily at Rebecca. "We need to get everyone's story straight. Could we see some identification from both of you?" This was the moment Patricia had been building toward, the grand reveal where she expected the police to discover that we were criminals or terrorists or whatever fantasy she'd constructed in her twisted mind. "Yes," Patricia called out triumphantly. "Please check their backgrounds thoroughly. I bet they have criminal records. I bet they're not even who they claim to be." She was practically bouncing with excitement, convinced that her master plan was about to pay off. I fumbled for my wallet, my hands shaking slightly from the stress of the situation, but Rebecca moved with the calm precision of someone who had been through this type of encounter before. Rebecca handed over her driver's license first, a perfectly normal Colorado license that showed our previous address in Denver. Officer Johnson glanced at it and nodded, then waited for the second piece of identification. That's when Rebecca reached into her purse and pulled out a second card, holding it out with the same calm confidence she'd shown all evening. "You'll want to see this as well," she said simply. Officer Johnson took the card, and I watched his entire demeanor change in the space of 2 seconds. His casual, slightly skeptical expression shifted to something much more serious and respectful. "Military ID," he said loud enough for Patricia to hear. "United States Army, military police investigator." He looked up at Rebecca with new eyes, the kind of respect that comes automatically when you're talking to someone who's served their country. That's when it happened. The moment I'll remember for the rest of my life. Patricia's face went through the most remarkable transformation I've ever witnessed. Her smug, triumphant expression melted away like ice cream in hell, replaced by pure, undiluted shock. Her mouth literally dropped open, and I watched the color drain from her cheeks as the reality of what she'd just done hit her like a freight train. She'd spent 2 weeks harassing, stalking, and intimidating a decorated military veteran. She'd called the police and accused a former military police investigator of being a dangerous criminal. The woman who had been so confident in her authority and righteousness suddenly looked like she'd been punched in the stomach. "Ma'am," Officer Johnson said, his tone completely different now as he addressed Rebecca. "You're military police." Rebecca nodded calmly. Former MP investigator recently discharged. I specialized in cases involving harassment, stalking, and abuse of authority. The way she said those words, harassment, stalking, abuse of authority, made it clear that she wasn't just describing her job experience. She was describing exactly what Patricia had been doing to us for the past 2 weeks. Officer Johnson's partner looked over at Patricia, who was still standing there, with her mouth hanging open like a fish out of water. "Ma'am," he said to Patricia, his voice much less sympathetic than it had been moments before. "You just filed a false report against a decorated soldier." Patricia tried to recover, stammering something about not knowing and just trying to protect the neighborhood, but the damage was done. Every neighbor who had been watching could see what had just happened. The woman who had positioned herself as the guardian of community safety had just been exposed as someone who'd spent 2 weeks terrorizing a veteran. I didn't know," Patricia finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was just trying to—" But Officer Johnson wasn't interested in her excuses. "Ma'am, filing a false police report is a serious offense. Making false accusations against a member of our military is even more serious." The authority in his voice made it clear that Patricia's little game had just blown up in her face spectacularly. The silence that followed was deafening. Our neighbors, who had been Patricia's eager audience just minutes before, were now staring at her with a mixture of shock and disgust. Mrs. Henderson was shaking her head sadly. The young couple from down the street was whispering to each other and pointing at Patricia. Even her most loyal supporters looked embarrassed to be associated with her. Patricia had gone from neighborhood hero to neighborhood pariah in the span of 30 seconds, and the look on her face suggested she was beginning to understand the magnitude of her mistake. But Rebecca wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Officer Johnson turned back to Rebecca with genuine respect in his voice. "Ma'am, would you like to press charges for harassment, stalking, and filing a false report?" Rebecca looked directly at Patricia, who was now visibly trembling, and smiled. But what she says next will change everything. Will Rebecca destroy Patricia right here, or does she have an even better plan? What would you do? Comment below. BD Stories has more epic. Rebecca looked at Patricia's terrified face for a long moment, and I could practically see the gears turning in her mind. The entire neighborhood was watching, waiting to see if she'd press charges against the woman who'd spent 2 weeks making our lives hell. Patricia was standing there like a deer in headlights, probably realizing that her little power trip had just turned into a potential criminal matter. But then Rebecca did something that surprised everyone, including me. "Actually, Officer Johnson," she said calmly, "I have a much better idea." She handed him a business card from her purse, something I'd never seen before. "I'd like to document this incident for now, but I won't be pressing charges tonight. Sometimes people make mistakes when they don't have all the information." Her voice was perfectly polite, but there was steel underneath it that made everyone present understand that this wasn't mercy. It was strategy. The business card Rebecca handed Officer Johnson was impressive. Embossed text on heavy cardstock that read, "Rebecca Mitchell Military Police Investigation, Division Financial Crimes Unit." Officer Johnson studied it carefully, clearly recognizing the significance of her credentials. "You specialized in financial crimes?" he asked, and I could see his mind working through the implications. Rebecca nodded. "White-collar crime, fraud, embezzlement, corruption cases. I've handled everything from small-scale theft to major conspiracy investigations." She glanced meaningfully at Patricia, who was still frozen in shock. "In my experience, when someone exhibits this level of aggressive territorial behavior, especially someone in a position of authority over community funds, it's worth taking a deeper look at the underlying motivations." Officer Johnson looked at the card Rebecca had given him, and his eyebrows went up slightly. "Military Police Investigation Division," he read aloud. "You worked serious cases." Rebecca nodded. "Harassment, stalking, fraud, abuse of authority. I know how these situations develop, and I prefer to handle them comprehensively." She glanced meaningfully at Patricia, who was still frozen in shock. "Sometimes the initial complaint is just the tip of the iceberg, if you know what I mean." Officer Johnson definitely knew what she meant, and so did I finally. Rebecca wasn't just letting Patricia off the hook. She was giving her enough rope to hang herself completely. My wife had been building a case from day one, and tonight was just the beginning of Patricia's real problems. Patricia seemed to think she'd gotten away with something when Officer Johnson closed his notebook without arresting her. As the police cars pulled away and the neighbors began to disperse, she actually managed to summon some of her old arrogance. "Well," she called out to the retreating crowd, "I hope everyone learns something tonight about the importance of community vigilance." but her voice was shaking and I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. Several neighbors who had previously supported her were now avoiding eye contact, clearly uncomfortable with what they'd witnessed. Mrs. Henderson actually stopped and stared at Patricia for a long moment before shaking her head in disgust and walking away. The cracks in Patricia's support system were already starting to show. After the police left and the neighbors dispersed, I followed Rebecca into our house, my mind reeling from what I'd just witnessed. "What the hell was that?" I asked as soon as we were alone. "You could have had her arrested. Why did you let her walk away?" Rebecca was already back at her computer pulling up files I'd watched her create over the past 2 weeks. "Because arresting her for harassment and false reporting is small potatoes, Alex," she said without looking up from her screen. "I've been investigating Patricia Williams since our second day here, and what I've found is much more interesting than a simple neighborhood dispute." She turned her monitor toward me, and what I saw made my jaw drop. Financial records, property documents, HOA meeting minutes, correspondence with city officials. Rebecca had assembled a complete dossier on our neighbor. The depth of Rebecca's investigation was staggering. She had somehow obtained 3 years' worth of HOA financial statements, city permits for neighborhood improvement projects, contractor licenses and certifications, and even property tax records for every house in Maplewood Estates. "How did you get all this?" I asked, scrolling through documents that looked like they came from official sources. Rebecca smiled that cold smile I was getting used to. "Military police training, Alex. When someone shows you who they are, you investigate them thoroughly before you make your move." She clicked through several files, highlighting sections that made my eyes widen. "Patricia Williams has been running this HOA like her personal kingdom for 3 years. Unauthorized fines, selective enforcement of rules, intimidation of residents who question her authority. But the really interesting part is what I found when I started looking at the financials." "How did you get all this?" I asked, scrolling through documents that looked like they came from official sources. Rebecca smiled that cold smile I was getting used to. "Military police training, Alex. When someone shows you who they are, you investigate them thoroughly before you make your move." She clicked through several files, highlighting sections that made my eyes widen. "Patricia Williams has been running this HOA like her personal kingdom for 3 years. Unauthorized fines, selective enforcement of rules, intimidation of residents who question her authority. But the really interesting part is what I found when I started looking at the financials." She opened a spreadsheet that showed HOA dues expenses and budget allocations going back 2 years. Patricia's been very creative with community funds. The financial records painted a picture of systematic fraud that made my stomach turn. Rebecca had documented dozens of suspicious transactions, payments to contractors for work that was never completed, maintenance charges for equipment that didn't exist, and landscaping bills for improvements that were nowhere to be seen in the neighborhood. "Look at this," Rebecca said, pointing to a series of entries from the previous summer. $15,000 for pool resurfacing, but the community pool was resurfaced just 18 months ago and still looks brand new. $22,000 for tree removal and replacement, but I've walked every street in this neighborhood, and there's no evidence of any recent tree work. The pattern was clear and damning. Patricia had been systematically stealing from her neighbors while hiding behind her position of authority. Before I could process what Rebecca was showing me, there was a soft knock at our back door. We looked at each other in surprise. It was almost 10 p.m., and we weren't expecting anyone. Rebecca checked our security monitor, and her expression shifted to something I couldn't quite read. "It's Mike Williams," she said quietly, "Patricia's husband." I'd seen Mike around the neighborhood, but never really talked to him. He was a quiet, nervous-looking man who seemed to live in his wife's shadow, always hurrying to keep up with her demands. Rebecca opened the door, and Mike practically fell into our kitchen, looking around frantically like he expected Patricia to appear at any moment. "I need to talk to you," he said in a whisper, "about my wife. She's not who you think she is." Mike looked like he'd aged 10 years in the 2 hours since the police had left. His usually neat appearance was disheveled, his shirt was wrinkled, and he kept glancing toward his house like he expected Patricia to come charging across the yard at any moment. "She's been drinking since the officers left," he said quietly, "screaming about how you've ruined everything, how she's going to make you pay for humiliating her. But then she started talking about covering her tracks, destroying evidence, and making sure certain documents disappeared." His hands were shaking as he spoke. "That's when I realized I couldn't protect her anymore. What she's been doing, it's not just wrong, it's criminal." Mike's hands were shaking as he sat down at our kitchen table, and I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool evening. "I've been watching what she's been doing to you," he said, his voice barely audible. "The violations, the harassment tonight with the police. I can't take it anymore." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope stuffed with papers. "She's been taking money from the HOA for fake repairs and improvements that never happened. I'm an accountant. I handle the books, and she forced me to help her falsify the records." His voice cracked as he continued. "She said if I didn't cooperate, she'd divorce me and take everything. But what she's doing is wrong, and after tonight, I can't be part of it anymore." Rebecca opened the envelope and began examining the contents with the methodical precision of someone who knew exactly what to look for. Bank statements, invoices for work that was never completed, correspondence with contractors who had been paid for services they'd never provided. "How much are we talking about?" she asked Mike, who was wringing his hands like a man confessing his sins. "Over the past 3 years, about $50,000, he said quietly. "She bills the HOA for landscaping improvements, pool maintenance, security upgrades, all fake. Then she has me transfer the money to accounts she controls." Rebecca looked up from the documents, it's with an expression that made me glad I wasn't Patricia Williams. "Mike," she said gently, "what you're describing isn't just HOA mismanagement. This is systematic fraud and theft." The implications hit me like a brick wall. Patricia hadn't just been harassing us because she was a control freak. She'd been protecting a criminal enterprise. "She saw us as a threat to her operation," I said, the pieces finally clicking into place. Rebecca nodded grimly. "A military police investigator moving into the neighborhood. Someone with the training and instinct to spot financial irregularities and abuse of authority. We represented everything she couldn't afford to have around." Mike was nodding frantically. "That's exactly right. As soon as she found out about you two, she started talking about getting rid of you before you could cause problems. She said people like you ask too many questions and poke around where you don't belong." Rebecca organized Mike's documents into neat piles, photographing each page with the systematic approach of someone building an airtight case. "Mike," she said when she was finished, "I need you to understand something. What you've just shown me is evidence of federal crimes. Mail fraud, tax evasion, theft of funds, and conspiracy. Patricia isn't just going to lose her position as HOA president. She's going to face serious criminal charges." Mike's face went pale, but he nodded resolutely. "I know," he said. "I've been living with this guilt for 3 years. I should have stopped her from the beginning, but I was scared. Tonight, when I saw her try to destroy innocent people just to protect her scams, I realized I'd rather face the consequences than be her accomplice anymore." As Mike prepared to leave, Rebecca walked him to the door with a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing," she told him. "And I want you to know that when this is over, you'll be protected. I've handled cases like this before, and cooperating witnesses who come forward voluntarily are treated very differently than the primary perpetrators." After he was gone, Rebecca returned to her computer and began integrating Mike's evidence into her existing files. "Alex," she said without looking up, "tomorrow Patricia Williams is going to discover that her 2 weeks of harassment were the biggest mistake of her life." She smiled that cold smile again, and I felt a shiver of anticipation. Time for some justice. But here's the thing. Patricia has no idea what's coming. What Rebecca discovered about Patricia's finances will destroy her completely. Are you ready for the most satisfying takedown ever? Comment, if Patricia deserves this, BD Story's final showdown. Patricia Williams called an emergency HOA meeting for 7 p.m. the next evening, and from the tone of her email blast, she was planning to make it the final showdown. Due to serious and ongoing neighborhood safety concerns, her message read, "All residents are strongly encouraged to attend this critical meeting regarding the removal of disruptive individuals who threaten our community standards and security." She'd positioned the meeting as her last stand against the dangerous outsiders who were undermining everything Maplewood Estates represented. What Patricia didn't know was that Rebecca had spent the entire day preparing her own presentation, and Mike had agreed to attend as a surprise witness. The stage was set for a confrontation that would end Patricia's reign of terror once and for all. Rebecca had spent the morning making phone calls to contacts from her military police days, verifying procedures and ensuring that everything we were about to present would hold up under legal scrutiny. She had also reached out to Officer Johnson, who confirmed that he would be standing by in case Patricia's arrest became necessary. "I've seen financial fraud cases before," he'd told Rebecca over the phone, "and if what you're showing me is accurate, this woman is looking at serious federal charges." The confidence in his voice had been reassuring, but I could tell that Rebecca was operating on a level of professional competence that made tonight's confrontation feel less like neighborhood drama and more like a military operation. The community center was packed when we arrived, with nearly every resident of our 50-house neighborhood in attendance. Patricia had set up at the front like she was conducting a town hall meeting, complete with a microphone projector screen and podium decorated with official HOA materials. She'd clearly put significant effort into making this look like a legitimate governmental proceeding rather than a personal vendetta. As residents filed in, I could see Patricia working the room, shaking hands and accepting supportive comments from neighbors who still believed her version of events. But I also noticed something else. Several residents who avoided eye contact with her, including Mrs. Henderson and the young couple from down the street. The events of the previous evening had planted seeds of doubt in some minds. The atmosphere in the room was electric with tension. Patricia had arranged the seating so that she commanded attention from the front, with her supporters clustered in the first few rows and the rest of the residents spread throughout the remaining chairs. She'd even prepared a slide presentation titled, "Maintaining Community Standards, a Crisis Response," complete with charts and graphs that made her look like a legitimate authority figure. Several residents were holding printed copies of Patricia's talking points, suggesting she'd been busy building her case all day. But what struck me most was how nervous she looked, despite all her preparation. There was something frantic in her movements, like someone who knew they were fighting for their life. "Welcome, everyone," Patricia began, her voice projecting that fake authority she'd perfected over 3 years of unchallenged power. "Tonight we address a serious threat to our peaceful community. Over the past 2 weeks, we've witnessed systematic intimidation, harassment, and defiance of established neighborhood standards by individuals who refuse to respect our way of life." She was laying it on thick, painting herself as the protector of suburban values against outside agitators. "We cannot and will not allow troublemakers to disrupt the safety and property values that make Maplewood Estates the premier neighborhood in our city." The applause from her supporters was enthusiastic, but not universal. I noticed several residents sitting with their arms crossed, looking skeptical. Patricia's presentation was a masterpiece of manipulation, carefully designed to make her seem like a reasonable authority figure dealing with unreasonable people. She showed photographs of our violations, read testimonials from concerned residents, and presented statistics about property values in neighborhoods that failed to maintain standards. She'd even brought in quotes from legal experts about HOA authority and homeowner responsibilities. "Some people move into established communities and immediately begin challenging the very systems that make those communities desirable," she said, her voice taking on an almost professorial tone. "They claim their backgrounds or connections entitle them to special treatment, but here in Maplewood Estates, everyone follows the same rules." Patricia's presentation continued for 20 minutes, complete with printed violation notices, photos of our infractions, and testimony from selected neighbors about feeling unsafe and concerned. She'd prepared charts showing declining property values in neighborhoods that failed to maintain standards, and she'd even consulted legal precedents for removing disruptive residents through HOA action. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, designed to make our presence seem like an existential threat to everyone's investment and security. "Some people think they can ignore our rules because they have certain backgrounds or connections," she said, looking directly at us. "But in Maplewood Estates, everyone follows the same standards. No exceptions, no special treatment." The crescendo of Patricia's presentation came when she unveiled her proposed solution, a formal vote to begin removal proceedings against us, backed by a petition she claimed had been signed by 27 of the neighborhood's 50 households. "I didn't want it to come to this," she said with fake sadness. "But sometimes protecting our community requires difficult decisions. We cannot allow our neighborhood to become a place where intimidation and harassment are tolerated, where military backgrounds are used to threaten law-abiding families." She was painting us as the aggressors, while positioning herself as the reluctant but necessary defender of suburban peace. Several residents were nodding along, apparently convinced by her carefully constructed narrative. That's when Rebecca stood up. She'd been sitting quietly through Patricia's entire performance, taking notes in a small notebook that she now closed with a decisive snap. "May I respond to these allegations?" she asked politely, her voice carrying easily through the room, without need for a microphone. Patricia looked momentarily flustered. She clearly hadn't expected any organized opposition to her carefully orchestrated show trial. "Well," she said, trying to maintain control, Residents are allowed to speak during the designated comment period, but Rebecca was already walking to the front of the room with a laptop bag and a file folder that looked suspiciously official. "Thank you," she said pleasantly. "I have some information that I think everyone should see." The transformation in the room was immediate and palpable when Rebecca began setting up her presentation. She moved with the calm efficiency of someone who'd briefed military commanders and federal prosecutors, and her professional demeanor stood in stark contrast to Patricia's theatrical performance. "Before I begin," Rebecca said, adjusting the microphone with practiced ease, "I want everyone to understand that what I'm about to show you is the result of a thorough investigation using methods I learned during my years as a military police financial crimes investigator." The mention of her credentials sent a ripple through the audience. Several people sat up straighter, and I noticed Patricia's face go pale. Rebecca connected her laptop to Patricia's projector system with the smooth efficiency of someone who'd given presentations before, and suddenly the screen displayed a title slide that made several people gasp. HOA Financial Audit, Maplewood Estates, prepared by Rebecca Mitchell, former military police financial crimes investigator. Patricia went white as a sheet, and I could see her hands start to tremble. "Wait," she stammered. "That's not, you can't just..." But Rebecca had already moved to her first slide, which showed a 3-year overview of HOA income and expenses, with several discrepancies highlighted in bright red. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rebecca said in the calm professional voice of someone presenting evidence in a courtroom, "I've been looking into your HOA's financial management, and I've discovered some very serious irregularities." The next slide showed specific examples of fraudulent expenses. $50,000 in payments to contractors for work that was never completed, maintenance charges for equipment that didn't exist, and landscaping bills for improvements that were never made. Rebecca's presentation was methodical and devastating, supported by bank records, canceled checks, and correspondence that proved systematic theft of community funds over 3 years. "Your HOA president has been using her position to steal money from every household in this neighborhood." Rebecca concluded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had prosecuted similar cases before. "What you've been told were necessary community expenses were actually payments into accounts controlled by Patricia Williams." The room erupted in chaos. Residents were shouting questions, demanding explanations, and turning to look at Patricia with expressions of shock and betrayal. But Rebecca wasn't finished. "Mike Williams," she called out, and Patricia's husband stood up from the back of the room, where he'd been sitting unnoticed. "Mike has additional evidence to present." Mike walked to the front with shaking hands, carrying a banker's box full of documents. "She forced me to help her," he said into the microphone, his voice breaking with emotion. "She threatened to divorce me and take everything if I didn't falsify the HOA books. I have copies of everything. Every fake invoice, every fraudulent expense report, every stolen dollar." Patricia tried to maintain control, standing up and shouting that this was a conspiracy, that the documents were fake, that her own husband was lying. But her protest fell on deaf ears. The evidence was overwhelming, and the residents of Maplewood Estates were finally seeing their HOA president for what she really was, a thief who had been stealing their money while hiding behind a facade of community leadership. Several residents were already on their phones, probably calling lawyers or the police, and others were demanding Patricia's immediate resignation. The meeting devolved into complete chaos, with Patricia at the center of a hurricane of anger and betrayal. That's when Officer Johnson appeared at the back of the room. Rebecca had called him earlier in the day, and he'd been waiting outside for her signal. "Patricia Williams," he said, his voice cutting through the shouting, "you're under arrest for theft, fraud, and conspiracy." He began reading her rights as 2 other officers appeared to assist with the arrest. Patricia's last words as they led her away were directed at Rebecca. "This isn't over. You can't do this to me." But Rebecca's response was delivered with ice-cold finality. "Yes, it is, Patricia. Justice always wins." The aftermath was swift and decisive. The HOA voted unanimously to remove Patricia from all positions and to begin the process of recovering stolen funds. Mike was granted immunity in exchange for his cooperation with the criminal investigation. Neighbors who'd supported Patricia's campaign against us came by our house over the following days to apologize, many bringing homemade food and offers to help however they could. Mrs. Henderson was particularly apologetic, explaining that she'd been intimidated by Patricia for years but was too scared to speak up. Within a week, a for sale sign appeared in front of Patricia's house, and by the end of the month, she and her legal troubles had become someone else's problem. As Rebecca and I sat on our front porch watching the moving truck load Patricia's belongings, I finally understood what my wife had been planning from the very beginning. "Feel good about how this ended?" I asked her. Rebecca was quiet for a moment, watching Patricia's house empty out like a symbol of justice finally served. "I feel complete," she said finally. Patricia Williams spent 3 years stealing from honest families and intimidating anyone who questioned her authority. She needed to face consequences, and she needed to face them properly. The neighborhood was finally at peace, and everyone could see that sometimes the best way to deal with a bully is to let them destroy themselves. But wait, what happened to Patricia after her arrest? And did the neighborhood finally get the peace it deserved? The ending will leave you feeling so satisfied, you'll want to watch it again. Comment if this satisfied you. What Karen story should BD Stories cover next?
What did we learn today? Probably nothing, but it was fun, wasn't it? Show some love with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to BD Stories.